Welcome to Spies and Spymasters Happy Hour, brought to you by the International Spy Museum. My name is Shauna Oltmans. I am the Exhibitions and Programs Manager at the museum. And tonight, Amanda Ohlke is going to be talking about the Revolutionary War spy, James Lafayette. And when she is done, we are going to be joined by a very special guest, Jamar Jones, who is the actor who portrays Lafayette in the museum's galleries. Now, before we get started talking about James Lafayette, we all need to get our drink. So let's head over to Stoney's on P Street, where Howie is whipping up a maple old fashioned. Hey, Howie.
Hey, what's up, Shanna? How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
You're doing a maple old fashioned for everyone. It's pretty simple and it's super tasty. You're going to start with 2 ounces of bourbon. It can be any kind of bourbon, your favorite. This happens to be Knob Creek. You add a little maple syrup, just like maybe 1/4 of an ounce, not very much at all. Then you want to add, we're using the orange bitters. It doesn't matter which bitters you use, but the orange bitters, put in like 4 little drops, and then you're going to stir it up. Just stir it up until the maple syrup dissolves, which takes next to no time. Boom. You add some ice on top of it. And then to be fancy, you add an orange peel.
We're always fancy, Howie. We're always fancy.
That's it. This is for you guys. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye, guys.
Thank you so much, Howie. For anyone in DC, Logan Circle area, Stoney's is open for pickup orders. So if you don't feel like making dinner tonight or tomorrow night or any night, head on over to Stoney's because they've got you covered. Now, on to our presentation. Amanda Ohlke is the Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum and was the lead developer of the museum's current James Lafayette exhibits. Part of her work on this exhibit was co-writing the script and overseeing the filming of the Lafayette video we have playing in the galleries. So Amanda, take it away.
All right. How do you tell a spy story? That's a question that we ask a lot at the International Spy Museum. Now, it's easier when the spy is alive and kicking and might even be able to answer some questions. They might not always tell the truth. They might not be able to. Maybe you're telling a historical story and there are some documents, but they might be classified. Maybe they've been declassified. Maybe they've been redacted. But usually there's something to go on. But what do you do when the spy whose story you're trying to tell died almost 200 years ago? Well, this is how we chose to tell the story of James Lafayette. I hope you've heard of James Lafayette, this Revolutionary War hero, a really inspiring man. Although born enslaved, he spied for the American side in the American Revolution. He did not choose to run off and fight with the British troops, although he would have been guaranteed freedom if he did that. There are lots of myths and legends that swirl around James, and I promise you that I will talk about those later. But what I wanted to do first, because we're a museum, is talk about what we know to be the facts. I'm going to tell you his story as well as I can based on the historical record. Then I'm going to show you that historical record. And so let's start. Now, James Lafayette, we don't even know for sure when he was born. It was either 1748 or 1760. We know he was born near Richmond in Virginia in Henrico County, and he was born enslaved to the Armistead family. That much we know. He was either about the same age or a bit older than William Armistead Jr. when the Revolutionary War broke out. He had been inherited. Now, William Armistead Jr. was the commissary for military supplies in Williamsburg, Virginia, when the Revolution broke out. So that means he's in charge of getting everything to the troops. They check in with him. And there's some thought that maybe James went with him. They're similar in age, or even James is his elder. It seems like someone he depended on tremendously. And we know from what happened later in James's life that he was an impressive person. So he may have served as a general manager with William Armistead Jr. We don't know. But it is there in Williamsburg in 1781 that James meets the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, the young Marquis de Lafayette is a French nobleman who has been swept up in the romance of the American Revolution, and he has sailed the sea to come and join us and help this new country be born. Now, it might seem odd for someone of the nobility to be fighting against a monarchy, but remember, France and England are not friends, and the French really don't mind sticking a thumb in the eye of the British. So the young Marquis is here, and he is commanding French troops in Virginia. And in Williamsburg, somehow he meets James. And as I mentioned, James must have been really quite an interesting person, because he volunteers to serve with the Marquis de Lafayette and to do whatever duties are required of him. He got permission from William Armistead Jr. to do this, and embarked on very hazardous work. And I want to thank Kenseth Armstead, the artist who did some of the work you're going to see included. He's very inspired by James Lafayette, and he let us use his work tonight. So the duty that James ended up doing for the Marquis de Lafayette was spying. He was in and out of the British camps. He's gathering intelligence for the Marquis de Lafayette. He is really endangering his life to get this intelligence. And, you know, he is always getting it back to Lafayette. How is he moving around? I love this image of him lurking outside a tent and listening in, and then running for his life. What kind of information is he looking for? He's trying to find out troop movements and supplies, ships, horses, manpower, all this to help General Washington to decide how and when to attack the British troops that are under the command of General Cornwallis in 1781. So he's gathering this intelligence, he's looking at things, he's listening, and he's got another job. In addition to spying, he seems to have been involved in some disinformation. He may have dropped false documents into the British's hands so that they would think the Americans were going to go in a different direction or undertake a different plan of attack. So this is incredibly risky business, because if he's carrying these material toward the British and the Americans find him, they might think he's a British spy and he would be hung. Or if the British see him with it and they suspect that he's an American spy, he would be hung. This is really a double jeopardy kind of operation. And yet he manages to do this. He manages to convey this misinformation into the hands of the British and survive. Now, the stress must have been unbelievable. So how did he possibly do it? Well, like any good spy, he probably used some form of cover. And he may have gone undercover as a servant in the British camps. And I'm going to read you the first verbatim historical document. Here are some excerpts from some letters that the Marquis de Lafayette, General Lafayette, wrote to George Washington in the summer of 1781. On the 31st of July, General Lafayette writes, "A correspondent of mine, servant to Lord Cornwallis, writes, on the 26th July at Portsmouth and says his master, Tarleton, and Simcoe are still in town but expect to move. The greatest part of the army is embarked. He continues on with details about ships and troops and manpower and adds, his servant is so shy of his papers that my honest friend says he cannot get at them. So this servant is actually in Cornwallis's tent. We saw that cool image of James lurking outside tents. Well, if he is this servant, he's inside the tent and actively looking at Cornwallis's desk. A second letter on the 25th of August, 1781, General Lafayette writes, I have got some intelligences by way of this servant I have once mentioned. A very sensible fellow was with him, and from him, as well as deserters, I hear that they begin fortifying at York. So we do not know if James was this servant, undercover as this servant, or if James was a person who was in communication with the servant to get the intelligence. So he might have been under a different type of cover to get in and out of the British camps, because we know he did that. He might have been undercover as a runaway freedom seeker. The English Lord Dunmore had issued this proclamation in 1775, and it offered freedom to any enslaved person who belonged to a patriot. It doesn't offer freedom to people who were owned or enslaved by patriots. So it has a fine point on it. But many people obviously took a chance on freedom and flocked to the British camps, and there were soldiers. Here's a detail from a painting showing an African American soldier who'd made this choice. And that's one of the interesting things we wonder about James. He did not choose his personal freedom. He chose to support the American cause, and that is very intriguing. So James might have been in the British camp pretending that he was a runaway who was seeking freedom. So that would have been very good cover. Or he might have been undercover as a forager. The drawing is not quite right, but it's as close as I could get. But a forager is someone who would bring goods into the camp for sale, something that the troops were not getting in their standard issue. And we've kind of recreated a forager's basket in our exhibit on James Lafayette, and the sort of things that a forager might sell. And my goodness, this is terrific cover, because then you really would be able to go in and out of the camps quite frequently, as often as you have things to sell. You could mingle around with all sorts of different people from high to low, whoever is interested in a fresh apple. You know, when you're lolling around, you're just waiting for your next sale. So you could listen in, and really, I think that is a very good cover for someone who needs to travel around a lot in and out of the British camps. But the thing we know is no matter what James, however he got there, how he went in and out, he had to have a brilliant memory, because he's not, you know, looking at ships and jotting down notes. He has to carry it all in his mind. He has to remember all this. He can't take a notes. He can't be caught with this sort of information. So in our exhibition, we have an interactive in which we challenge you to see how much you can remember. And this is the first image you'll see, and it has, these are all period accurate historical artifacts. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to look at this, and then I'm going to test your memory. So I'll be quiet for a few seconds. I bet that didn't feel like long enough. It never feels like long enough. But I want to, how many coins? did you see? What color was the feather quill? What utensils did you see? And what types of documents did you see? Give you a second to think about it, and then I'll give you the answers. There were 5 coins, and they were split apart. Very rude. The feather quill was white. There were 2 spoons and 1 fork, and then the documents were a map and a newspaper. And I bet you the map would have been the really interesting thing to a spy. So anyway, I don't think I had the skill set. I don't have the risk-taking ability, nor do I have the memory skill set to do what James did. So what were the results of this intelligence he gathered? Well, based on intelligence provided by General Lafayette, Washington's troops laid siege to the British forces hunkered down in Yorktown, Virginia, and blocked reinforcements from reaching them. It was a decisive move. General Cornwallis surrendered at York on October 19th, signaling an end to the war. Wow. So this is pretty impressive stuff, and James was involved in this definitive battle of the American Revolution. So how do we know this? How do we know what James did? Well, I read you those excerpts from letters, but they don't directly point to James, but they do point to the use of spying. Well, it's for an unfortunate reason that we know some of the information about James, and that is because after the war was over, he was not free. Soldiers who had fought for the American side were given their freedom, but James had not been a soldier. He had been a spy. He fell into a very strange loophole. And it's because of petitions for his freedom that we know a lot about what he did. So he first petitioned in 1784, and he was unsuccessful. But later that year, he met up with General Lafayette once again. And at that time, General Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, wrote a commendation for James. Now, this commendation no longer survives, although we know what it said. And I'm going to read it to you, if you don't mind. This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him, and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Done under my hand, Richmond, November 21st, 1784. So that is a document that James later attached to his second petition for freedom. This is from November of 1786, and I'm sorry for the light version of the document, but in this petition, including the commendation, this following is written. During the time of his serving the Marquis, he often, at the peril of his life, found means to frequent the British camp, by which he kept open a channel of the most useful communications to the army of the state, that at different times your petitioner conveyed enclosures from the Marquis into the enemy's lines of the most secret and important kind, the possession of which, if discovered on him, would have most certainly endangered the life of your petitioner. So the commendation and this petition tell us about the disinformation, the intelligence. They tell us about the peril that James was in. Well, the addition of the Marquis' commendation certainly helped, and James was granted his freedom, which he received in January of 1787, and he took the last name Lafayette as a mark of honor for the Marquis de Lafayette. So it's interesting, his owner, his enslaver, William Armistead Jr., was willing for James to seek his freedom. And the holdup, he wouldn't just free himself, and this is a difficult thing to talk about, but enslavers were paid for losing the loss of an enslaved person who was freed. And William Armistead had some financial issues by being the head of the commissary in Williamsburg. He had some financial setbacks. I don't think the government had paid him back. And even though he might have wanted James to be free, he wasn't ready to give up that kind of money. And that's a really crass thing to say about a human life. But it's interesting to me that Armistead was paid £250 for James as recompense. And typically, someone at that time, if an enslaved person was executed for a crime, they would have been paid £100. So James was worth 2.5 times an ordinary person of this time. And I just think it says to the enormous skills that he must have had available to him. So we have another document about James. This is later on. He is a free man. He is James Lafayette. He is a landowner. He is married. He has been a farmer. But now he's searching for a soldier's pension from the government for having fought in the Revolutionary War as a spy. And here again is one of our documents that tells us about James Lafayette. And this is very interesting. Contrary to the disposition of many in his situation, he felt an ardent desire to render the American cause all the services of which he was capable, and for that purpose solicited and obtained the consent of his said master to join in the service under the commander of the French forces, General de Lafayette. Hazardous indeed were the offices which your petitioner was appointed to perform, having many times at the peril of his own life entered the British camp and conveyed to his general such as information as was deemed highly beneficial to the American cause. So it's from this petition we find out that he volunteered, that he had permission, that he supported the American cause. So this is how we put the history together, and I hope you find it as interesting as we do. But there is another piece to this story. This is the return of the Marquis. This is 1824. The young United States is maybe feeling a little shaky. Maybe some of the brilliant minds of the time think the country could use a little shoring up. We need a little more patriotic fever. And what could be better than inviting this hero of the American Revolution, the French General Lafayette, to come and tour the States at that time and sort of rally support for the country. And the Marquis de Lafayette, was a great friend and protege of General Washington. His son is named for Washington. And so he comes in 1824, he arrives in Staten Island, and then proceeds on this tour of the States at that time. And it's in Richmond during one of these parades. He sees James in the crowd and he stops the parade and they embrace. And this gives me goosebumps every time I hear it, thinking of these two reunited in this way and coming together and showing the bond that they had after all this time and what they must have gone through together. So I think it's because of this dramatic trip by the Marquis de Lafayette that this wonderful portrait of James Lafayette exists. Now, my apologies to the Valentine Museum in Richmond that has this wonderful painting on display. I have brightened it beyond the point of what I should, but it's so it would show up better for you. But you feel like you want to know this man. I love his face, and I feel like he'd be a really fascinating person to spend some time with. So this painting was painted in 1824, and you might recognize it as the basis for this engraving. Now, the man, John Martin, who painted the portrait, was an engraver, and he created this document And it is why we know what the Marquis de Lafayette's commendation for James said, because the commendation doesn't exist anymore, but that's the transcription of it below the bust of James Lafayette. And this is basically a souvenir. This is like a go Nats or all caps or, whatever you have, you've been to the circus, you've been to the fair, you've been to the theater. This is something that you save. Hamilton, the Guide to Hamilton, something that you would save and love. And so it's because of the Marquis' kind of, victory tour, getting the band back together, that these materials were created. So that gives us this other piece of historical evidence. All right, now, I promised to talk to you about some of the myths that are out there that may or may not be true. The first is that James was a double agent. And that is based on the idea that perhaps James was the servant in Cornwallis's camp. And the story goes that one day, Lord Cornwallis got this brilliant idea and looked at his servant and said, hey, you know what? You'd make a really good spy. How about you go over to the American camp and spy for me? And I think we all love the idea of someone like James saying, oh, never thought of that. Meanwhile, he's been spying himself. We have no documentation for that, but it is a story that has survived. And another thing that's interesting is supposedly at the surrender, when General Cornwallis got there, he saw James in the American camp and he said to him, you rogue! He recognized him. Well, that is a really cool story, but either because he was sick or he was pretending to be sick, General Cornwallis did not attend the surrender ceremony. So if it happened, it didn't happen there. And then there's lots of suggestion in oral tradition that James spied on the traitor Benedict Arnold when he turned to the British side and was in Virginia, that James offered to help him be a guide because he knew the Virginia territory and then could spy on Benedict Arnold. Now, we don't know about this, but I now turn to kind of the last chapter in what we know about James. This is the frontispiece from a novel from 1828 called Edge Hill, and it was published in Virginia in Richmond, and it's this romance, but quite interestingly, it has some very strong secondary characters, and one of them is a sable patriot, an African-American spy named James. And James uses cover, goes undercover as a slave at a dinner party to figure out who at this dinner party is Benedict Arnold, so that then he can attempt to assassinate him. I don't know. This certainly links James with Benedict Arnold in a really fascinating way. Well, this would just seem like an old-timey novel with James as a character, but what an interesting link. As I mentioned, James applied for and did receive a pension from Virginia for his spying during the Revolutionary War. And the document you see with the 20 on it, that is a receipt for him picking up his pension payment. And the gentleman that he picked it up from, James Ewell Heath, is the author of Edge Hill. So whether he was just so taken by knowing James and hearing about him and really embroidered on his story, or if there was even more to James's story than we'll ever know. I just had to share that. And that novel, you can find it downloadable on the internet. So how do you bring a story with so much guesswork like this together? Well, we wanted to bring James to life, and we turned to our friend Jamar Jones. Jamar is an award-winning actor, teaching artist, and museum theater practitioner in Richmond, Virginia. He's a William and Mary grad, and he's appeared in numerous regional productions, including Fences, Passing Strange, and Octoroon and Red Velvet. Jamar collaborates with museums and historic sites throughout Virginia and Washington, D.C. to bring stories of enslaved and free Black people of the past to life. I hope I didn't call him James in the middle of his bio, because he's Jamar Jones. Jamar had performed as James Lafayette at the International Spy Museum in 2017. We had a special traveling version of Slave Spy, which is a piece that was commissioned by the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. So when we were drafting our script, we asked Jamar for his input. And I've got a very short clip of Jamar Jones as James Lafayette. And then when we come back, Jamar Jones is going to join us, and I'm going to ask him a few questions, and then you can too.
So in the end, I received my freedom and liberty for my country. But how did I do all my spying? Did the British think I was a spy for them too? Well, like I said, you'll never know for sure. A good spy never tells.
Hi, I am back, and where is my friend? There's Jamar.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Jamar. Thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure. I wish I was seeing you in person, but I'm happy to. I know, and I get to see you like every day when the museum's open.
Right, I love it. I love it, and it's nice to be here. Nice to be here.
Great. Well, I have some questions for you, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. You portrayed James Lafayette and other historical figures for us in other museums. How in the world did you get into this line of acting?
So it's always a story with me. But back in 2013, I was actually on tour, traveling around the country, and I was in the Midwest, and it was a bad snowstorm, so I was stuck in a hotel, and my tour was actually about to end in a few months, and I said, oh gosh, I need a job. And, I need to plan for something. So I was trying to audition for things, throwing it all out there. And I came across this living history museum that was hiring people as actors. And specifically, they were looking for someone who could portray enslaved people. So, at first, honestly, I really thought about it as, okay, a job, let's go. And, I got the job as a living history performer there. And I'll tell you, as the years have gone on, it's just kind of opened up doors for me to work with various museums, to travel in the 18th century, the 19th century, to do historically based dramas. And, it's just continued on from there. So that's how I kind of fell into this world of performing.
Well, how do you prepare for these roles? I mean, they're a big adjustment. What's the biggest adjustment you have to make as you travel back in time?
Exactly. Well, the first things first, you have to be a researcher. And to be honest, I won't say I was a bad history student in school, but it wasn't necessarily my number one subject. But doing this sort of work, because you're dealing with the lives of people who actually were here. And so you really want to make sure that you're doing right by them and you're giving their story justice. And so you really look for all the historical documents that you can. And in my case, usually I'm portraying enslaved people during that time period. So I'm looking at runaway ads, I'm looking at inventories, I'm looking at newspaper articles that might say anything about their lives, because a lot of times you can't come across that. And so that's what I usually do first. I prepare with that. And then for me, I had to think about it at first, but I had to really think about them as a fully living human being, right? I consider all sorts of things, that these people love different things, they hated different things made them laugh. And I try to take all of that and use it to craft the lives of these people. And so a lot of times I really have to get out of my own way to be truthfully, because you can have your mindset from 2020, but you have to remember you're dealing with people from centuries ago, and so life for them was very different.
Do you think that's one of the biggest challenges you face in this line of work?
Sometimes I would say, I won't lie, I never have taken, I will never know what it's like truly for these people to live as enslaved people, thankfully. However, taking on that persona of somebody who's endured a lot, and just somebody who was property, right? By law, these people were considered to be property of someone else. And sometimes it really is unfathomable, of course, for us. But, difficulties sometimes appear in different ways depending on how people receive the historical figure you're portraying or the information that you're relaying. So it's never a dull moment, I tell you that.
Well, I know you've told me a few stories. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing any stories about presenting in person.
Oh, of course. Well, my family always jokes. They said, "Oh, you need to write a book. Write a book about these experiences." But I will tell you, overwhelmingly, I have a lot of positive interactions. People who want to come and learn things. I think about, yes, I'm an actor, but when I'm portraying the lives of these people, I also look at myself as an educator because I'm trying to give you a perspective that actually was for people who lived during that time. And so for me, you never know what you get, but a lot of times people say, thank you for sharing that. You've opened my eyes to a new perspective. But I think about a few years ago, I was doing a performance, and this specific piece really dealt with race relations in America during the 18th century and also today. And we also examined the idea of what it was like for people today to portray people of the past, either as an enslaver or as an enslaved person. And this woman came up to me, and she was from South Carolina. She expressed how she was a mom and a Girl Scout troop leader of her daughter's Girl Scout group. And she said that her group was pretty diverse and split down the middle. She said that, half of her girls were white, half of them were black. And she shared something with me. She said that she wanted to talk with me after my interpretation. She said because one of her black Girl Scouts came up to her and asked genuinely a question. She said, will I be made a slave again? And, and I shared that because, for us, it's like, how did she get to this question? Why does she feel this way? But, I talked with this woman, and I was just, I said, well, you just have to be honest, and you have to take her through history. But, in that moment, I really didn't have the words, but we just spent about 30 minutes, and we just sat and we talked about things. And, I think about experiences like that because slavery is uncomfortable for us all, right? And it is. It's uncomfortable to examine, uncomfortable to talk about, to portray these stories. However, it's a part of our history. And so I'm grateful that I can sit there and do that. And I do want to say one more thing. I had a situation, I was portraying someone, an enslaved man who was a carpenter. And these people, this was in the summertime, and these people, they sat with me for an hour. We talked, and it was another colleague, beautiful couple, lovely, lovely. They had said, please let us know if you're doing anything else. And like 6 months later, when I came to do Slave Spy, written by Abigail Schumann for you all, that couple just showed up, and they were at the presentation to see my interpretation as James. And I said, wow, so I just do this work, but you never know what people will take away from it. And so I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Now, and maybe I'm biased. Do you have a favorite character that you like to portray, and why?
Oh,
and it might not be what I think.
Right. Well, I really can't say that because it's like I'm attached to all of them. Whether it's James Lafayette. I portrayed a man named London Pleasance who fought for the British in the Revolutionary War, and even Thomas Jefferson's manservant, Jupiter. But I'll tell you, some people who I portray, of course, because of historical documentations, you do get a deeper connection with some of these people because you know so much more about their lives, and therefore you can infer different things, what happened. You can talk about certain things, which I love. So I can't say that there's one specific person.
What do you think is the biggest surprise or delight or shock for people experiencing you as James or other figures from, it doesn't have to just be the colonial period. But.
Yeah. I think the biggest shock that people have, they'll say, you actually felt that way? Or you're talking like this? Because, I think people really, they do travel back with you, and they think because I'm portraying someone who's enslaved, and I have portrayed free blacks as well, but because of society during the time period, of course, we don't have endless amount of journals from enslaved people and their specific feelings. However, we know these people were surrounding these areas, right? They were doing all sorts of work, right? And so they were watching, they were listening, they were participating, they were aiding. And so I know people think, I think a lot of times people are shocked just about the perspective, right? I've portrayed an enslaved person offering my commentary on the Declaration of Independence. What is it like for someone who's enslaved to hear the phrase "all men are created equal," yet they are in bondage? And so I think people are often surprised by the perspective, but usually once they get over that initial shock, they're like, "Okay, tell me more. Let's sit and talk." And we have a good time.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm going to invite Shauna to join us, and let's hear from the audience. But I'm going to take it back to James, my Spy Museum story. What would you most like? I know there's lots we'd like to know about James. What would you most like to know about him?
Honestly, I would want to know what James's motivation was. From his perspective, what was his motivation to say, hey, I want to fight for the patriot cause, the continental cause, if you will. I wanted to remain loyal because, as you stated before, there was an opportunity for freedom, not just from Dunmore's proclamation, but, the Phillipsburg Proclamation, which was offering an escape and protection for enslaved people if they, Black people at the time, if they go over to the British side. And, James really made a huge sacrifice for this country. He didn't initially go in for his personal gain, for personal freedom, because we know that, as you said, he didn't receive that. And so I want to know what made him stay that course and what made him want to do that. And so I wish we could ask him that.
I know. Was it family ties? Was it, you don't want to leave Virginia? Oh, it's so interesting.
Yeah, so much.
Yeah. Shauna, are you? There she is.
Yeah. Jamar, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I have a ton of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. But to start off, Amanda or Jamar, do you guys have any biographies about James Lafayette that you would recommend to folks?
You go ahead, Jamar.
Yeah. Well, so for me, I might not say specific biography, but I know there's a lot of research that I've looked at. I know Kate Gruber, she's spoken at the International Spy Museum. She's done extensive research, and there's an incredible presentation from her online. I've really immersed myself in a lot of the primary documents and things, but I don't know, Amanda, if you have any specific biographies.
I mean, it's funny. I had that Choose Your Own Adventure. I liked the image of James that I had early on. I have not seen that book. I think it's a young adult book. I have not really seen anything. There's a wonderful old article, but it's not entirely accurate in it, from Virginia Cavalcade magazine. He's due for a book, Jamar Jones.
Well.
You mentioned Kate Gruber. She was going to present at a conference of the North American Society of Intelligence Historians. I know she wrote a paper, and I'm hoping that that may end up in the journal of those proceedings, but everything slowed down.
Well, we have some audience members who also think that this is ripe for a film to be created telling James' story. So, Jamar, you've got your audition tape already for once that gets going.
We just need the budget, we need the production, and it's back me up.
Exactly. So this is an interesting question connecting to some other maybe more well-known spies during the Revolutionary War, but was James Lafayette ever associated with the Culper spy ring?
No, they were operating out of New York, and James was totally focused in Virginia. I don't know. Oh, well, actually, he died in Baltimore, so he did leave Virginia, right? So, yeah.
Okay. All right. And then also, do you believe that James's work with Armistead in the commissary assisted him in terms of determining force strength and movement when he was working as a spy?
Absolutely. I think so. You have to imagine, we're not specifically sure what exactly James did, but we believe, he assisted him and attended him. So therefore, James is going from perhaps New King County. He's down in Williamsburg. He's with the people moving in the capital when the capital moves to Richmond in 1780. And so, of course, imagine all the people he was encountering, the things that he was seeing, the conversations he was hearing, and just the travel, right? He's covering the land. And so I think he absolutely is doing this. And you also have to keep in mind, think of the other enslaved people perhaps James had to encounter and the information they had and the correspondence that was happening there. So yes, yes.
Awesome. And then this is an interesting question. I've had a few people asking this. Do we know if James was literate?
Yes. So we certainly can believe that James was literate, not only based off of his petitions for freedom, right? We know that he is writing that himself. However, one thing I should say, just to know about literacy, a lot of times people wonder, can enslaved people read or write? And it's not until later in the 1800s, roughly around 1819, when a law is actually put in place saying that it is illegal to educate enslaved people for them to learn. But all the way in the 18th century, there were opportunities for enslaved people, specifically depending upon their work. And just know literacy across the board, white or black, it really just depended on your line of work. Because if you're a farmer, you might not necessarily need to read, but we definitely can believe James is literate. I was watching something in Kate's presentation, Kate Gruber's presentation, when she was saying that they said that James had something on his person, and people, we can infer perhaps that it might have been something written by him and that he might have been writing some of his intelligence. So yes, I absolutely believe that he was literate.
And that's one of the reasons I brought up the uncomfortable fact of his cash value, but the fact that he was so very valuable. And at that point, he could have, been late 40s, who we don't really know, right?
Right.
But yet he's worth so much. You feel like he must have, and it's potentially his signature on the pension receipts, like the one I showed.
Yeah, and so you definitely, I completely agree, and all those things for people to know, it's hard to think about value being determined on a person, but those sort of things would have been taken into consideration for James, especially that literacy, and that would have added, yeah, definitely.
James, can I ask for a self-correction? Where was he born in Henrico County?
I've heard they say roughly Henrico West. I heard West Hampton in the New Kent area, but I've heard different things about that. Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I spoke out of turn, so sorry.
It's okay.
This is a question I think for you, Jamar, but Amanda, you could also probably answer it as well. What in your research and studies of James, what did you find out that was most surprising to you when you were learning about him?
Most surprising. I would say just his, I really would say his determination, and not saying that I would have doubted it, but what I mean by that is how after the war ended and, he's relayed this information, James did not get his freedom immediately. However, he's remained diligent in petitioning for that. And then, he somehow got this letter, he requested this letter from Marquis de Lafayette on his behalf. And so to me, just that perseverance that he has and that, because, can you just imagine that, you sacrifice the opportunity to get freedom, and then after the war, you're not free. And, freedom is not necessarily in sight. And so for him to just keep going and for freedom to come years later and for him to go on and have land, I think just his journey was the most surprising of anything, just that.
And I just, I'm a sucker for a cinematic moment, the parade in Richmond and the old war heroes embrace. I mean, I just really,
yeah.
That's the movie. That's for the movie.
That's the movie. That's the movie. We'll have to write that down.
Absolutely. And Amanda, you mentioned, later on in life, James is a farmer and all these things. Do we know anything about James's family? Any surviving relatives he may have had?
Do you want to? You probably know more. I know.
I know about we presume that he had his wife, Sylvia, and there were several people, I guess on the record that were people in James's household. Some were enslaved, we know, but we don't know specifically if some were his children. We don't know if there specifically was family or if people can be hired out. Because, sometimes that's the tricky thing about when you examine record books during this time period, you don't know specifically the circumstance is, and also who is who, what the relations are. But we know that he had family, and I will say I was doing a performance as James, and I met some descendants. They were saying James Lafayette descendants that were still residing late in the Yorktown area, and they were his family. So that was beautiful.
Because it may be that the people in the census that were marked as enslaved people in his household, that might have been so you didn't have to send family away. If they were freed, then they might have to leave the area. It's such a dicey time.
And it's also good for people to know it wasn't, there was a very small window of period of time for people to be manumitted. And of course, manumission was freeing people from slavery. And to do that, you had to go to a court and you had to have done something that would have been deemed meritorious service. So, just the idea, a lot of people say, why don't you just free somebody? That it wasn't always honestly possible. It was impossible sometimes because of the law. And I'm just going to sign this here. My computer might want to die on me, but we don't want that. This is live. This is a live moment here. But I'm still here.
It adds a lot of excitement.
It does.
I know. There we are.
It does. Yes. I have this question about Amanda, when you mentioned the Marquis de Lafayette later on coming and meeting with James and finding out that James has done these petitions, yet he was still enslaved. How did James end up getting to see the Marquis de Lafayette at that time? Do we know how they ended up meeting up at that point?
Do you know, Jamar? I mean,
I've heard a lot of speculation. I heard at one time people were saying that the meeting happened in Richmond and it happened in Yorktown, but now I believe they say Richmond. But I've heard a lot of grand tales that that the Marquis de Lafayette was in his carriage and all of these people were surrounded, and that he stopped the carriage and he saw James out in the crowd, and he moved and said, "Stop the carriage, that is my friend." But we don't know. I think that's one of those moments where we do a lot of speculation. We know that an exchange somehow happened, and so these are the moments when you have to infer things about history and just the setup of how did it happen. But and
the fact that they met in the first place. I mean, might have just been in the general after effects of the war.
Right. Exactly. And see, these are the moments when we're like, oh, please just come back and visit us for a little bit and give us the details.
Yeah, what I was trying to convey, and I think it came across as, God, we're so lucky to know what we know, but the unfortunate thing is it's because he had to petition so hard that we know what we know. Right,
exactly. Absolutely.
All right, sorry, there's so many questions coming in, trying to sort through all of them. Jamar, what is your favorite era to portray? Or do you have an era that or a historical figure who you would love to get to depict?
I know that's a good.
I added a little bit more to the.
You did. My favorite era. So I would say, I did a performance and I was able to actually portray Ira Aldridge in the 1800s. And he was, if you don't know him, he was one of the first Black Shakespearean actor in London to take on the role of Othello, and so he has the interest in history. But as far as our time period, the 18th century, I'm interested in portraying Benjamin Banneker. I wanted something keeps resonating about his story with me, and I really want to explore that. But for me, really just any chance I get to portray people who, I don't have to have a lot of information on them, but to know that they lived in just something there, I love just taking the opportunity to put a face to their experience and their story. So that's what I'll say.
So I have to ask Jamar, this is one of the questions that came in, but if history wasn't your favorite subject in school, yet you seem so passionate about it now, what was your favorite subject?
Ooh, theater. But honestly, but I did well in school. I would like to say that's not me being conceited, but I like to say I did. But yeah, so I really, the theater bug got me. But besides that, I loved English. I did love English, and so the play on words. But I think I probably have a few teachers watching right now. They could probably attest. I was in class, and I'll do my work, but honestly, I got bit by the bug in high school, and it was just mind blowing for me. And so I really got swept up into theater, and so here we are today. But I do have a great appreciation for history now, especially with this line of work, because you have to research. I look at this work as I call it like a challenging privilege. Why it's a privilege? Because I get to give voice to these people that you probably have never heard of sometimes, and let you know that they actually live. But it is challenging because it's during a time period that was very difficult and very dark for our collective history. But I love telling the story.
Well, you do a wonderful job of it.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm going to finish with this one last question that's talking about James. And at the end of his life, is he known or referred to as a patriot and a hero? What is his legacy, if there is really one?
Amanda, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you are.
Well, I'll say I think James truly embodies a definition of what a patriot was, because someone in his shoes, he was not like many of the people who would have been his counterparts, some of those people serving. He never initially had his freedom from the start of his life, and he went into the war knowing that his freedom was not guaranteed, yet he stayed dedicated and loyal to this country. He offered information that was a success at the Battle of Yorktown for them to win, for this country to call itself independent, to be a free nation. And he stayed that course, and he still didn't have his freedom. And so I think that is truly the definition of someone being a patriot, of so giving of himself, and he sacrificed that. And so I love, I saw that in Virginia, some of the SOLs for students, part of their curriculum is to know about James Lafayette now. And I didn't have that as a kid. And so I think he should totally be considered to be part of a hero, because, what he did was certainly instrumental.
It's interesting that he has survived the knowledge of him. It seems like he's always been there in, histories. There just will be a mention of him, and then we start getting the mythologizing, which some of it might be true. We don't know, but it's intriguing because there was no giant wreath laying when he passed away.
Right.
It was not a black banner on the newspapers of the time, but he stayed with us, and that's just amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's a beautiful thing to think about the evolution of research and the evolution of history, that maybe 30 years ago people probably never really heard about him, but all this information we got. And what excites me is how we know about James. Imagine all the other stories that possibly we might come across, all these documents, and
what we haven't done is Lord Cornwallis's papers. That has not been tapped into, and there may be something there. So maybe somebody will see this on YouTube,
right
now, and they'll go to the National Archives in Kew, and get us some new information.
Please help us out.
That'd be wonderful. Oh my gosh. Well, Jamar, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know for us and many of the staff at the museum, we see you every day in the museum as Lafayette. So it is so wonderful to get to see you tonight and hear from you in person, because you have such incredible insight into James's story and into just interpreting this history in general. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you all so much. It was a joy being here. Anytime I get to see you all makes my day.
Someday soon in person.
in person. We claim that. Yes, 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 for sure.
Exactly. So I also want to give another thank you to Stonies and Howie for making that fantastic cocktail. And I also want to tell all of you guys still here about some upcoming programs we have coming up. Finally, if you're enjoying these programs and if you're able, please consider contributing to our Mission Resilience campaign just to help us keep creating these wonderful programs. But thank you so much for joining us. We hope you had fun, and cheers to all of you.
And now Jamar and I can actually have a drink.
Yes.
Yes, you can. All right.
There we go.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jamar.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you. So good to see you.